Jackson, Mississippi, 2022. A charismatic youth pastor was adored by his congregation for his powerful sermons on faith and freedom. In reality, he was a predator who held 3 of his female devotees captive for years in a hidden dungeon, a soundproofed chamber built directly beneath the church pulpit. While police treated their disappearances as frustrating cold cases, he preached above them, his perfect image the ultimate cover. Then, a violent thunderstorm flooded the church basement, leading investigators to a welded steel door and a discovery that would unmask a monster hiding in plain sight. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you the story. Detective Angela Ross believed in patterns. In her 17 years with the Jackson Police Department, she'd learned that random evil was a myth. Chaos had a blueprint, and violence, no matter how senseless it seemed, left behind a thread. You just had to be patient enough to find it. Her current obsession was a bulletin board in the corner of the cold case unit, a space populated by the silent, smiling faces of the forgotten. 3 women, 3 ghost files, each a testament to a thread that had snapped. First was Tanya Miller, a kind-faced woman whose file was thin with the tragedy of a life that had simply evaporated. Gone for 2 years. Her family, living out of state, reported her missing after weeks of unanswered calls. Her apartment was empty, car gone, no sign of struggle. The official report concluded with the weary shrug of a case destined for the archives. Subject likely relocated due to personal distress following mother's death. It was a neat, logical box, but it felt wrong. People who run away to start over usually take their favorite books or the photos from their nightstand. Tanya's apartment had been left as if she'd just stepped out for milk. Next was Keisha Turner, a vibrant choir singer whose disappearance a year and a half ago was even more perplexing. Her roommate swore Keisha was on a week-long church retreat, but couldn't remember the location. Keisha never came back. Her car was still parked in its designated spot, a parking ticket tucked under the windshield wiper like a sad, yellowed postscript. The file was thicker, filled with dead-end interviews and speculative theories about religious communes, but it ended in the same place. A cold, silent void. The most recent ghost was Renee Collins, a volunteer counselor who had vanished 10 months prior. Her case was different. Renee was a planner, a woman of schedules and goals. Her sister's testimony was a raw, frustrated plea for an investigation that had lost momentum. Renee would never just leave, she'd insisted. Someone took her. But with no evidence of foul play, no body, and no leads, her file had joined the others on the board of silent faces. 3 women, different ages, different lives, different circumstances. The original investigators had seen no connection, but Ross, looking at them day after day, felt a professional itch she couldn't ignore. The files were stacked on her desk, the pages worn from her constant review. She wasn't looking for a smoking gun. She was looking for a whisper. A single point of intersection in 3 otherwise parallel lines of loss. She spent a week cross-referencing every name, every address, every phone number listed in the hundreds of pages of reports. Friends, employers, landlords, distant relatives. Nothing. Frustrated, she went back to the beginning, focusing not on the people, but the places, the coffee shops, the grocery stores, the gyms. And then she found it. It wasn't a dramatic discovery, just a quiet, chilling click of a puzzle piece falling into place. In Tanya's file, a friend mentioned Tanya had found comfort after her mother's death at a local church. In Keisha's file, her primary social circle was her choir. In Renee's file, her main volunteer activity was listed as a mentorship program. The name of the institution was the same in all 3 reports, New Hope Tabernacle. It was just a thread, thin and circumstantial, but it was there. A single address, a single community, linking 3 women who had been swallowed by the world. Ross stood back from the board, looking at the smiling faces. They weren't 3 random ghosts anymore. They were a pattern, and the pattern had a location. Her investigation had just found its ground zero. New Hope Tabernacle was less a building and more a campus, a sprawling red brick fortress of modern faith that took up an entire city block. Its manicured lawns, immaculate welcome center, and state-of-the-art youth wing projected an image of prosperous, organized devotion. To Detective Angela Ross, pulling into the visitor parking on a Tuesday morning, it felt less like a house of worship and more like a corporate headquarters. It was a place that presented a perfect, impenetrable face to the world. Her appointment was with Senior Pastor Raymond Holt, a man in his 60s with kind, weary eyes and the gentle, authoritative air of a man accustomed to leading his flock. He met her in his spacious, book-lined office, offering her coffee with a warm, genuine smile. He was cooperative, his concern for the missing women seemingly sincere. He remembered each of them, speaking of their contributions to the church with a sad, paternal fondness. But as Ross began to ask more pointed questions about their last days at the church, their social circles, anyone they might have been close to, a subtle, almost imperceptible wall went up. He was cooperative, but he was also protective. He was the shepherd, and she was a wolf circling his flock. "Our church is a family, Detective," he said, his hands steepled on his large oak desk. "We celebrate together, and we grieve together." The loss of these women was felt by us all. But to suggest that the church itself is somehow connected to their disappearance is a difficult thing to comprehend. He offered her access to volunteer logs and attendance records, a gesture of transparency that Ross knew was largely meaningless. Such records would show only presence, not the complex human dynamics that unfolded within these walls. As the interview was winding down, the office door opened, and the subject of Ross's real interest walked in. Youth Pastor Eli Crawford was charisma made flesh. He was handsome, dressed in stylishly casual clothes, and moved with an easy, confident grace. He greeted Pastor Holt with a familiar warmth, and then turned his full, undivided attention to Ross, his smile bright and disarming. "Detective Ross, it's an honor," he said, shaking her hand. His grip was firm, his eyes holding hers with an unnerving intensity. "Pastor Holt told me you were here. Anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to ask. Tanya, Keisha, and Renee, they were all family. We've been praying for their safe return since the day they left." He was perfect. Too perfect. He answered her questions with a practiced, thoughtful sincerity, his brow furrowed with concern. He spoke of his counseling sessions with Tanya, his admiration for Keisha's voice in the choir, his professional respect for Renee's work. He gave away nothing. His answers were a smooth, polished surface with no cracks, no handholds for a detective to grab onto. He was an alibi in human form, his very public goodness the ultimate defense. He was a fortress within the fortress. Ross left the church with a handful of useless records and a profound sense of unease. She had no evidence, no probable cause, not even a concrete reason to be suspicious beyond a single, common address. But a cop's gut is a powerful, unquantifiable tool, and hers was screaming that she had just met the monster she was hunting. He was hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, in plain sight, bathed in the adoring light of a house of God. The facade of New Hope Tabernacle wasn't just perfect, it was a strategically engineered blind spot, and Eli Crawford was its master architect. A detective's intuition, no matter how strong, is not probable cause. Angela Ross knew that a judge would laugh her out of the courtroom if she tried to get a warrant based on a chilling certainty and a perfectly practiced smile. If she couldn't get inside the fortress of New Hope Tabernacle through the front door, she would have to find a way to listen through the walls. Her investigation turned from direct confrontation to the slow, painstaking, and often tedious work of forensic accounting. It was a metaphorical wiretap, an attempt to hear the church's secrets through the dry, emotionless language of numbers. Working from her desk late into the night, fueled by stale coffee and a growing obsession, Ross subpoenaed years of the church's financial records. It was a mountain of paper tithes, donations, payroll, operational expenses. For weeks, she saw nothing but the ordinary financial life of a large, successful nonprofit. But Ross was looking for the anomalies, the single line item that didn't fit the pattern. She found it buried in the maintenance and repair budget, a series of invoices from the past 2 years, all submitted by and personally reimbursed to Eli Crawford. The first set of receipts was from a specialty acoustics company for over $2,000 worth of high-density, professional-grade soundproofing foam. The work order was vague, citing youth band practice room upgrades. The second set was even stranger, a cash purchase from an industrial supply warehouse for a heavy-duty steel door, reinforced deadbolts, and, most bizarrely, welding services from a local mobile welder. The final invoice was the most damning, a bulk purchase of canned goods, bottled water, and chemical toilets, enough to supply a small army, categorized under youth mission trip supplies, a trip for which there was no other corresponding paperwork. The numbers told a story, a dark, chilling narrative of preparation and construction. Someone at that church had built a soundproofed, reinforced, self-contained room and stocked it for long-term occupation, and the money trail led directly to Eli. While she was digging through the finances, Ross began to subtly cultivate her most valuable potential asset, Pastor Raymond Holt. She didn't approach him as a detective investigating a suspect, but as a concerned official following a loose thread. She would call him once a week, under the guise of asking a follow-up question about one of the missing women. She was planting a seed of doubt, giving his own vague unease a direction. She'd mentioned the financial records casually, just trying to make sense of some of these expenses, Pastor. Seems your youth ministry has a very generous budget. At first, Holt was defensive, protecting his protege. But Ross's persistent professional questioning began to align with his own observations of Eli's increasingly secretive behavior. He started to notice things he had previously dismissed. Eli's insistence on being the only person with keys to certain storage areas, his sharp, out-of-character rebuffs of anyone who got too close to the youth wing's back rooms. The pastor's loyalty was at war with his conscience. The turning point came when Ross quietly emailed him copies of the invoices with a simple, 2-word message. For clarification. Seeing the cold, hard proof of the soundproofing and the welding, disconnected from Eli's smooth, plausible explanations, was a profound shock to the old pastor's system. He didn't reply to the email. But the next time Ross called, the defensiveness in his voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, terrified whisper. "What do you think is happening at my church, detective?" The wiretap was working. The walls of the fortress were beginning to talk. While Angela Ross was meticulously building her case from the outside, a desperate, silent investigation was unfolding within the dungeon itself. The discovery that they were not alone had been a cataclysmic event for Tanya, Keisha, and Renee. The initial dizzying wave of relief was quickly followed by the cold, horrifying clarity of their situation. They were not chosen, they were a collection. Their captor was not a misguided spiritual guide, he was a predator with a system. This knowledge transformed them. The crushing weight of their individual despair was replaced by the terrifying but empowering energy of a shared secret purpose. To survive, to resist, and to somehow, someday, bear witness. Renee Collins, the counselor, naturally became their strategist. Her mind, trained to identify patterns of behavior and manipulation, was their sharpest weapon. Through the thin metallic membrane of the air vent, she guided their covert resistance. "We have to become our own investigators," she whispered to the others during one of their hushed, late-night conversations. "We have to document everything. His words, his habits, his lies. If we ever get out of here, our memories are the only evidence we'll have." Their prison became a laboratory. They were no longer just captives. They were behavioral scientists studying their captor. They started a secret, shared journal, using the blank pages from the back of the Bibles he had given them and a pen Keisha had managed to keep hidden. Each day, after Eli's visit to one of them, that woman would have the solemn duty of recording the details. They noted the time of his arrival, the food he brought, the specific scriptures he used, the psychological state he seemed to be in. They documented his lies with a forensic, damning precision. "Told T he is protecting her from worldly grief," one entry read. "Told K her voice is becoming purer with each day of sacrifice," read another. The journals were their most precious and dangerous secret. They were kept disassembled, the individual pages hidden in tiny tears in their mattress linings, ready to be destroyed in an instant if discovery seemed imminent. This act of documentation was more than just evidence gathering. It was an act of profound intellectual rebellion. He had tried to control their reality, to trap them in a timeless, disorienting void. But with their secret calendar, scratched onto the hidden metal frame of a cot, and their meticulous, dated journal entries, they were reclaiming time itself. They were creating a record, a timeline of their stolen lives, a document that defied his entire doctrine of control. Their alliance was a delicate, high-stakes ballet of deception. When Eli was in the room, they had to perform their assigned roles: the grieving penitent, the hopeful devotee, the intellectual collaborator. It was an exhausting, soul-crushing performance. But the knowledge that the others were just a few feet away, listening, bearing silent witness, gave them the strength to endure. They developed a subtle code of coughs and hums, a way to signal to the others that they were okay after Eli's visits. Their shared faith, once the tool of their imprisonment, was now the glue that held their resistance together. They prayed through the vents, their whispers weaving together in the darkness. But their prayers had changed. They no longer prayed for understanding or for spiritual release. They prayed for strength, for clarity, and for a single, tangible miracle, a discovery, a mistake, a crack in the perfect facade of the man who preached above them. They were a ticking clock in the dark, gathering the evidence that would one day convict their own captor, hoping their time wouldn't run out before someone on the outside finally started listening. The break in the case, when it finally came, was not the result of a clever deduction or a dramatic confession. It arrived with the chaotic, impartial fury of a Mississippi thunderstorm. For 2 days, a late summer squall line had hovered over Jackson, dumping a historic amount of rain onto the already saturated ground. It was an act of God, in the most literal sense, and it would prove to be the one variable that Eli Crawford, in all his meticulous planning, had never accounted for. The church's ancient drainage system, designed for a gentler era of rainfall, was quickly overwhelmed. Water, seeking the path of least resistance, began to force its way through the very foundations of the building. In the dungeon, the constant, maddening drip of the single pipe was replaced by a dozen new leaks, then a steady trickle, and finally, a horrifying ankle-deep pool of cold, murky water. The women huddled on their cots, their meager belongings soaked, listening to the gurgling, groaning sounds of their prison being compromised. Above ground, the church's main basement was a disaster zone. The sump pump had failed, and a foot of water now covered the floor. The maintenance supervisor, Earl, waded through the gloom, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, trying to locate the primary source of the ingress. He noticed the water was deepest in the back corner, the area beneath the youth wing. As he sloshed closer, he saw that the water wasn't just seeping through the cinder blocks. It was flowing, with a noticeable current, from underneath a sealed, out-of-place steel door he hadn't even known was there. His call to Pastor Raymond Holt was not one of simple concern, but of genuine alarm. The pastor arrived minutes later, his face a mask of grim foreboding. He stood with Earl, their boots submerged, and stared at the door. The sight of it, combined with the copies of the invoices Detective Ross had sent him, was a moment of terrible, sickening clarity. The soundproofing, the welding, the lies. It all led here, to this impossible, welded door. His own internal investigation, his crisis of faith, was about to collide with a very real, very wet, physical reality. He knew he could no longer handle this internally. The secrets of his church were literally seeping out of the walls. With a trembling hand, he pulled out his phone and dialed the one person he knew was already listening. Detective Angela Ross. Ross understood the significance of the call the moment she heard the pastor's strained voice. This was it. The anomaly. The physical break she needed. She arrived at the church to find a scene of controlled chaos. The water in the basement was being pumped out, but the area around the steel door was now cordoned off with a makeshift barrier. Ross didn't need a warrant to see what was in plain sight. A modern, professionally welded door where no door should be, in a church with 3 missing members. The fortunate flood had done more than damage the church's foundation. It had washed away Eli Crawford's last line of defense. The physical and metaphorical walls were about to come down. The air in the flooded basement was thick with the smell of damp concrete and the tense, palpable silence of a brewing confrontation. Detective Angela Ross stood before the welded door, a small team of uniformed officers flanking her, their presence a stark, official intrusion into the sacred space. Pastor Holt stood off to the side, his face ashen, looking like a man watching his own world crumble. The final piece of the tableau arrived in the form of Eli Crawford, summoned from his office upstairs. He descended the stairs, not with the panicked energy of a man whose secret was about to be exposed, but with a preternatural calm, his face a mask of polite, concerned inquiry. "Detective, what's all this?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the damp space. "Earl told me we had a flood, but this seems a bit excessive." "We've discovered an unlisted sealed room in your church's basement, Pastor Crawford," Ross stated, her tone flat, professional, and devoid of accusation. "A room you allegedly had soundproofed and welded shut. We're going to open it." Eli managed a small, condescending laugh. "As I explained to Pastor Holt months ago, that's just a hazardous electrical closet I had sealed for safety. You'll be wasting your time and city resources, and frankly, putting your officers at risk." He was confident, his performance flawless. He was counting on his authority, his unimpeachable reputation, to carry the moment. "I have a warrant that says my time won't be wasted," Ross said, producing the signed document from her jacket pocket. It was a bluff. The warrant was being expedited, but wasn't yet in her hand, but it was delivered with such absolute conviction that Eli's smile faltered for just a heartbeat. "And the fire department's heavy rescue unit is 2 minutes out. They'll be handling the risk." The standoff was broken by the arrival of the firefighters, their heavy gear and powerful equipment a sudden, brutal intrusion of force. They set up a portable generator, and the basement was filled with the deafening scream of a plasma cutter. Sparks rained down, hissing as they hit the standing water, illuminating the stark, opposing expressions of the two pastors. Holt's, a mask of horrified resignation. Eli's, a cold, unreadable slate. The firewall of his charisma was being physically breached by a blade of superheated gas. The process was brutally efficient. They cut through the thick, welded hinges first, then used a hydraulic spreader, the jaws of life, to pry the door from its frame. With a final, groaning screech of tortured metal, the door was wrenched open. A wave of foul, stale air, thick with the scent of bleach and human confinement, billowed out. Ross and her officers raised their flashlights, their beams piercing the darkness. The scene that the light revealed was one of meticulous, long-term horror. The 3 cots, the table with its scattered, twisted scriptures, the journals, and huddled in the far corner, on the one dry patch of concrete, were 3 women. They were pale, thin, their eyes wide with the terror of the violent noise. But as their gazes adjusted, that terror was slowly, miraculously, replaced by a dawning, disbelieving hope. They were alive. Ross felt a wave of cold fury and profound relief wash over her. She took a step forward, her voice soft, trying not to startle them. "My name is Detective Ross," she said. "We're with the police. You are safe now." Behind her, Pastor Holt let out a choked, guttural sob, the sound of a man's faith being utterly and completely shattered. Eli Crawford said nothing. He simply stood, motionless, as the intricate, hidden world he had so carefully constructed was broken open and exposed to the light. The arrest could have been a quiet, discreet affair, a simple summons to the station. But Angela Ross knew that a significant part of Eli Crawford's power, his very shield, was his public persona. His goodness was his alibi. To truly dismantle him, she had to do it in the place where that goodness was manufactured and consumed, the main sanctuary, in the middle of Sunday service. It was a calculated, strategic decision, designed not for humiliation, but for public unmasking. She needed to sever the deep, emotional connection he had with his congregation, the very people he had used as cover for his monstrous crimes. The following Sunday was a beautiful, sun-drenched Mississippi morning. Inside New Hope Tabernacle, the pews were full, the air humming with the energy of communal worship. The events in the basement had been successfully contained, dismissed as a private church matter. On the stage, bathed in the warm theatrical glow of the stage lights, Eli Crawford was at the peak of his powers. He was delivering a fiery, passionate sermon on the nature of persecution, of being a righteous light in a dark and unbelieving world. "They will not understand your sacrifice," he boomed, his voice resonating with a performer's perfect conviction. "The world will look at your devotion and call it madness, but you must stand firm in your faith. For blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." It was at that moment, as if summoned by his own words, that the large oak doors at the back of the church swung open. A collective murmur rippled through the congregation. Detective Angela Ross stood silhouetted in the doorway, then began her slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle. She was flanked by 4 uniformed officers, their presence a shocking, silent, and undeniable intrusion. The organ music trailed off. The choir fell silent. Every eye in the sanctuary was fixed on the small, determined procession. They watched, 1,000 people holding a collective breath as the officers walked past their pews, their faces grim and professional. Eli stopped his sermon, his hand still raised in a dramatic gesture. He watched them approach the stage, and a slow, beatific, and deeply unsettling smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of fear or surprise. It was a smile of validation, of a martyr meeting his destiny. He placed his Bible on the pulpit as Ross and 2 officers ascended the steps. He turned and offered his hands, wrists together, before she even spoke a word. "Eli Crawford," Ross said, her voice clear and firm, but kept low, a private exchange in a very public space. "You are under arrest for the unlawful confinement and psychological coercion of Tanya Miller, Keisha Turner, and Renee Collins." The metallic click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the vast, silent hall. A wave of audible gasps and whispered cries swept through the pews. Eli turned back to his flock, his smile never wavering. As the officers began to escort him from the stage, he raised his cuffed hands in a gesture of tranquil blessing. "Do not weep for me, my family," he called out, his voice ringing with theatrical sorrow. "For the shepherd must sometimes be sacrificed for his flock. Hold fast to the truth, and pray for those who are lost in the darkness. One Zerver, everything's." He was a master manipulator to the very end, casting himself as a victim, his arrest a test of their faith. He continued to quote scripture as they led him down the aisle, a charismatic prophet in chains. The congregation was left in a state of stunned, horrified chaos, their faith, their trust, and their entire worldview shattered in the space of 3 minutes. The shepherd had been taken from them, but not before revealing himself to be the very wolf he had so often preached against. The prosecution's case against Eli Crawford was built not on a single, dramatic piece of evidence, but on the slow, methodical construction of an irrefutable narrative. The assistant district attorney, Maria Flores, understood that to convict a man like Eli, a man shielded by a veneer of public adoration, she had to do more than prove his guilt. She had to clinically dissect his sainthood. The trial became an exercise in forensics, both physical and psychological, and the star witnesses were not just the women he had confined, but the very tools of their confinement. The most powerful evidence came from the dungeon itself. The secret journals, which the women had so painstakingly kept, became the prosecution's roadmap. They were authenticated by handwriting experts and presented to the jury not as simple diaries, but as meticulous, contemporaneous logs of a long-term crime. Flores had excerpts enlarged and displayed on a large screen in the courtroom. The jury read, in the women's own words, the daily accounts of Eli's psychological games, his manipulative use of scripture, his carefully documented lies. "Told K she is the only one pure enough for this calling," one entry read. "Told R her research is vital for the salvation of others," read another. The journals were a devastating, real-time refutation of the defense's claim that this was a consensual religious retreat. They were the testimony of the dungeon itself. Next, Flores called an expert on religious cults and coercive control. The expert, a calm, academic woman, had analyzed the twisted scriptures and writings that had been plastered on the dungeon walls. She explained to the jury, in clear, accessible language, how Eli had employed classic indoctrination techniques. "This is a textbook example of what we call milieu control," she stated, gesturing to a photo of the verse wall. "The subject is isolated from all outside information, and their reality is completely redefined by the controller. Scripture, in this context, is not used for spiritual guidance. It's weaponized. It becomes a tool of absolute psychological dominance." She walked the jury through the rewritten verses, showing how Eli had stripped them of their original meaning to create a personal doctrine of submission and sacrifice. The financial records Ross had uncovered formed another pillar of the prosecution's case. The invoices for the soundproofing, the industrial steel door, and the welding services were presented one by one. The welder himself, a gruff man who remembered the job clearly, testified that Eli had paid him in cash and had been insistent that the door be as strong as a bank vault. The prosecution was methodically proving premeditation. This was not a spontaneous act of faith. It was a carefully planned, meticulously constructed prison. Eli's defense team tried to paint him as a radical, misunderstood spiritual innovator. They argued that the journals were simply expressions of deep personal faith, and that the construction in the basement was a misguided but well-intentioned effort to create a space for intense spiritual devotion. But with every piece of evidence, every expert witness, every canceled check, their narrative grew weaker, more desperate. The prosecution was not just putting Eli Crawford on trial. They were putting his entire manufactured reality on trial. And with the cold, hard facts of the journals, the invoices, and the expert analysis, that reality was being systematically and completely dismantled. The emotional core of the trial, the moment the legal strategy and forensic evidence gave way to raw, human truth, was the testimony of the survivors. The prosecution had saved them for last, building a foundation of irrefutable fact upon which their stories would stand as the final, unassailable capstone. When Tanya Miller, Keisha Turner, and Renee Collins walked into the courtroom, one by one, a profound hush fell over the gallery. They were not the broken, spectral figures the public might have expected. They were composed, their faces set with a quiet determination, their strength a palpable force in the room. Tanya took the stand first. In a soft but unwavering voice, she recounted the story of her grief and how Eli had so expertly woven himself into the fabric of her pain, promising her a sanctuary that had become a prison. She spoke with a heartbreaking clarity, her testimony a quiet, powerful indictment of his predatory empathy. She did not weep, but the entire courtroom seemed to feel the weight of her stolen years. Keisha followed, her vibrant, hopeful spirit now forged into something harder, more resilient. She locked eyes with Eli as she took her seat, a silent, powerful challenge that he refused to meet. She spoke of her faith, of her trust, and of how he had perverted both. Her most powerful testimony centered on the moment of discovery, of hearing a voice through the vent. "He told us we were alone," Keisha said, her voice rising with a controlled, righteous anger. That was the foundation of his power. But he was wrong. In that darkness, we found each other, and we were not alone. Finally, Renee Collins, the counselor, took the stand. Her testimony was a masterclass in clinical deconstruction. She was not speaking as a victim, but as an expert witness who had been forced into the most immersive case study of her life. She calmly and methodically detailed Eli's techniques of manipulation, using the very language of her profession to label his actions: gaslighting, coercive control, induced dependency. She described how they had organized their resistance, how they had created their secret journals, how they had fought back not with force, but with intellect. "He thought he was in control," Renee stated, her gaze fixed on the jury. "But for the last year of our confinement, we were studying him. We were gathering the evidence. We were preparing for this day." Their collective testimony was devastating. It was not a plea for sympathy, but a presentation of fact, delivered with a grace and intelligence that left the defense with nowhere to go. On cross-examination, Eli's lawyer tried to poke holes in their stories, to suggest they were willing participants. But the women were unshakable. They met every question with a calm, factual response, their credibility absolute. The jury was out for less than 90 minutes. The speed of their decision was, in itself, a statement. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a solemn expression, stood to read the verdict. He did not look at Eli. He looked at the three women, who sat huddled together in the front row. On the count of unlawful confinement of Tanya Miller, the foreman's voice boomed in the silent room. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. They're preceded. But he was not. On round, they're dotted. He repeated the finding for Keisha, and then for Renee. Guilty, guilty, guilty. A wave of quiet, cathartic sobs broke from the gallery. Eli Crawford's face remained a blank, emotionless mask, his final performance that of a man detached from consequence. But for the three women who had survived him, the verdict was more than just a legal victory. It was the sound of their truth, once confined to whispers in the dark, now declared as undeniable fact in the clear, bright light of justice. The reckoning for Eli Crawford was swift and clinical. At his sentencing, the judge condemned his actions as a profound and monstrous betrayal of trust, sentencing him to the maximum allowed by law for his crimes. The 10-year sentence was, to many, a shockingly light punishment for the years he had stolen and the lives he had systematically dismantled. But for Tanya, Keisha, and Renee, the number was secondary. The true victory was in his conviction, his public unmasking, and his removal from a position where he could harm anyone else. His power, once absolute, was now gone. The reckoning for New Hope Tabernacle was longer, quieter, and in many ways, more painful. The church, unable to survive the weight of its own scandal, was disbanded. The sprawling brick building was sold to a secular community organization, its sanctuary stripped of its pews and its pulpit, the symbols of a faith that had been so deeply betrayed. The congregation scattered to other churches, carrying with them the difficult, unanswered questions of how they could have been so blind, how evil could have worn such a perfect, charming mask in their midst. But the most meaningful reckoning was the one that belonged to the survivors. In the months following the trial, the three women found that their story resonated far beyond the borders of Jackson, Mississippi. They were inundated with messages from people across the country who had experienced their own forms of spiritual abuse. Individuals who had been shamed, controlled, and manipulated within the closed, high-demand environments of various churches, sects, and cults. They realized that their experience, while extreme, was not unique. The darkness they had endured was a darkness that thrived in silence and secrecy all over the world. They found a new purpose in this realization. They were not just survivors. They were witnesses for countless others who had not been heard. With the support of community leaders and a national victims advocacy group, they established the Sanctuary Project. It was a non-profit foundation dedicated to providing resources, counseling, and a public voice for survivors of religious manipulation. Their mission was to shine a light into the dark corners of faith, to empower victims to reclaim their stories, and to educate communities on the warning signs of coercive control. A year after the trial, Tanya, Keisha, and Renee stand together on a sunny afternoon, not on the steps of a courthouse, but at the dedication of the first counseling center opened by their foundation. They are surrounded by other survivors, by supporters, by a new community built not on a shared doctrine, but on a shared experience of resilience. They have taken the word that was the name of their prison and transformed it into a symbol of their purpose. They have built a new, true sanctuary, one founded on empathy, truth, and the unshakable belief in the power of a voice that refuses to be silenced. They have reckoned with their past, not by erasing it, but by using it as the foundation for a future filled with hope, not for themselves alone, but for all the others who were still lost in the dark.